record. So we are now on page Roman numeral 26, the introduction, second paragraph, contemporary critical theory.
Right. One moment. Yes. So this is after he's, I think, given an exposition of all the chapters, right? Contemporary critical theory represents a radical shift in Western thought, resulting in new perspectives and methodology.
Okay, give me a moment. I just want to do something here, but so let me just a word about contemporary critical theory and what it means. So contemporary critical theory, or the premise of contemporary critical theory, is that knowledge, even scientific knowledge, has a political, historical aspect to it. So what they do is, or let me, I didn't phrase that well. What they're saying is that knowledge is shaped by human interest. And because human interests vary from nation to nation, from culture to culture, what they call to be knowledge, what they call to be truth, will vary. And even science, even the scientific perspective on things, varies from culture to culture, so that there is no objective reality. Because in the Greek times, they used to believe that there's an objective truth, right? And the Wissenschaft des Studenten was based upon there being an objective truth against which you can measure other cultures. And you say, this culture, like the British, are very close to the truth, or they are the truth. You know, the Indians are very far from the truth. Similarly, the Sephardish, the Franks, they're not really, they're very primitive, because we have this objective standard and we can measure the Sephardim relative to this objective standard. Not like the Germans in the University of Berlin. I'm not talking about during Nazi Germany, I meant a little before Nazi Germany. So they had the objective truth there. So that's why contemporary critical theory is so important, because suddenly we get rid of this premise that there was this objective truth against which you measure everything else. And now that opens up the idea of subjectivity. And let me just give you a great example. Quantum mechanics, which itself says there is no objective truth, came about partially, or the other way around, I don't know which came first, the chicken or the egg, because people started thinking in terms of contemporary critical theory, which says there is no objective truth. So you see that even science says there is no objective truth, interestingly enough.
That's very interesting.
Yeah.
This shift now allows for a better understanding of rabbinic semiotics and textuality.
Because the rabbis themselves negated the idea that there is an objective truth against which all of the truths must be measured. This is one of the great mahlokot between Ramban Nachmani from Catalonia and the Andalusian Chachamim like Rambam. For the Andalusian Chachamim, the derashot reflect the particular Chacham that's making a derashah. And a latter betin can get away with the derashah of a previous betin, if they wish to do so, because the derashah doesn't represent the actual Torah. According to Ramban Nachmani, the derashah, the Yagmidot, are themselves the Oraitam, and the derashot that you make from the Yagmidot are themselves the status of the actual Torah, because they had a very Platonic view. So that becomes that derashah that the Chacham made in the Gemara becomes the actual peshat, and there is no other meaning, and that is the meaning. So you see how Ramban Nachmani and the Catalonian rabbis, they had more of the Greek view of the world, whereas the Andalusian rabbis had more of the quantum mechanic critical theory of view of the world.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting. In the West, philosophy stood in hierarchical opposition to rhetoric. The opposition further generated a whole series of hierarchical oppositions. For example, inner, outer, content, context, thought, language, speech, writing. In this sense, philosophy as well as rhetoric are specifically Greek.
Right, so let me explain to you. In Western thinking, in Greek thinking, you had philosophy, which represents the substance of the truth. Mm-hmm. And then you had rhetoric, which is just how you phrase it. So a good rhetorician can actually try to convince you that a falsehood is true. but it's just rhetoric and you shouldn't take it so seriously. What's important is the actual mahut, the actual substance of the knowledge. So in Greek thinking, there's philosophy, which is really important, and rhetoric, which is less important. The splitting of the logos. Jeda has an article called The Splitting of the Logos where he examines this. But then from this idea where you have philosophy versus rhetoric is no good. You also have the idea of, you have the inner person and the outer person, or the, so for example, in the Dati Leumi community in Israel, and I love them, of course, you know that. But for example, the outer is not so important because what's important is what's inside the person. So you can be dressed in a sloppy way, shirt kind of untucked and, look kind of disheveled, and it's all good because what's really important is who's the real person, right? So you see how the splitting of the logos, it led to a whole series of other splits. And this is part of Greek thinking. Interesting, in the Torah thinking, how a Talmid Chacham is dressed and how he looks is important. So here you see Catalonia versus Andalusia, Greek versus contemporary critical theory.
Rabbinic tradition is the only intellectual and cultural movement to have continued developing since antiquity without a primeval rupture, an inaugural split, resulting in an endless series of hierarchical oppositions.
Right.
He has a long note here, by the way.
Yeah, we should read it. But the point being that we didn't have the splitting of the logos like they had in the Greek thinking. We did not have that, right? What footnote is this?
81.
Okay, so by us, rhetoric is important. And that's why you have like the whole book of Sifre. What is the book of Sifre? What is the book of Sifra? What is the Mechilta? It's rabbinic rhetoric. Oh, but that's not so important. Yes, actually, it is, right? We never underwent the splitting of the logos. So how you formulate an idea is as important as the idea itself, right? You can't formulate the idea in language, then there's something wrong with your thinking, or there's something wrong with the idea, right? Read the footnote.
Reading the footnote. It's footnote 81. In modern times, this split has led into what Jose Ortega y Gasset calls the barbarism of specialization, the real disarticulation of knowledge. The specialist is defined as follows.
Because the minute you have specialization, you're not a lawyer, you're a corporate lawyer. And you're not just a corporate lawyer, you're a securities corporate lawyer. You're not just a securities corporate lawyer, you deal with criminal violations of the securities rule. And you're not just a person who deals with criminal violations of the securities law, but you're dealing with violation of section whatever. You understand? So the barbarism of specialization, it makes people into barbarians because people know nothing about the humanities. They don't even know anything about law. They just know about very, very specific. And when you only know that and nothing else, that's barbarism.
The specialist is defined as follows. He is one who, out of all that has to be known in order to be a man of judgment, is only acquainted with one science. And even of that one, only knows the small corner in which he is an active investigator. He even proclaims it as a virtue that he takes no cognizance of what lies outside the narrow territory specially cultivated by himself, and gives the name of,
dilettantism, meaning to dilly-dally, like you're come on, like stop going in a derachim akalkalot.
Right, to any curiosity for the general scheme of knowledge.
Right.
One of the most significant aspects of the specialist is the state of not listening. By specializing him, civilization has made him hermetic and self-satisfied with his limitations. But this very inner feeling of dominance and worth will induce him to wish to predominate outside his specialty.
Right.
That I didn't understand.
Right.
But yeah.
Right, but because of the arrogance, let me explain that. Because so you understand what the barbarism specialization is, and that this person is an expert. He is a true worldwide expert on how the carbon emissions from cow farts is destroying the planet, and he knows everything about cow farts and what the gas comes out and how it's really destroying the planet. He knows nothing about anything else. But because he's the expert, he has a certain arrogance, and he will express his opinion about other things because he is the authority. He is the Rebbe. he has the right to express an opinion. So he will not just talk about cow farts, but he will talk about the economy. And he will talk about, yes, of course, we can get rid of all fossil fuel emissions within the next 5 weeks. And it will not have an effect on the economy because the new jobs that will be created will far outweigh the calamitous effects on the economy. So this is the way people talk. Interesting. One of the things I noticed in Israel, because when I was studying in America, and I don't know what it's like today, but America always emphasized the humanities, the study of the humanities in college. So even if you were, let's say, majoring in biology, you had to take history, you had to take philosophy, you had to take the humanities. And that very much followed the ideas of Giambattista Vico, as opposed to the Greek ideas, the barbarism of specialization. One of the things I noticed in Israel, which fascinated me, was that people knew nothing about anything outside the very specific field. And because they know nothing about anything, it's very easy to fool them. Because when people are not educated, you can talk about the peace process. And, you say, well, what about the peace process back in, World War I, World War II, and all those peace processes? But they don't know history. They know nothing, so they can't think. But they have the arrogance. I'm an expert. Do you know who I am? And they'll pretend like, of course, we understand this. So that's what this footnote is about, right?
Right. I'll continue in the main text.
Right. But in the days of World War I and World War II, we're talking about how the world will have a new global order and peace will be, peace is upon us, right? Right before the wars, tens of millions of people, or probably more even, I don't know how many killed during the war. Peace is upon us, yes.
Pretty amazing how naive people.
But that's the point. So that's a barbarism of specialization. Is on the one hand, you are the authority. But with that comes arrogance. You know nothing about it, but you have the arrogance as if although you do know, and that leads to catastrophe.
Unfortunately, it also has to do with the fact that there's always a dominant, there's always like a dominant perspective or societal view that whether it's right or wrong, good or bad, dominates the mind of the people, of the masses. So you have the media here now, a great example. The leftist media in America now has a very specific agenda, and it dominates the minds of the people, whether or not the agenda is correct, incorrect, good for them, not good for them, because that's the way it is, and that's the way masses work, unfortunately.
Yes, correct. And that's why
this gap of specialization makes it even worse, because people don't know how to think for themselves about anything outside of their little arba ammot.
And that's why totalitarian regimes don't want people to be educated.
Right.
Because if people were educated, they wouldn't buy nonsense like bring in Yasser Arafat, the chief terrorist, bring him and his army and weapons into Israel, and peace will break out. Well, if you're an educated person, you'll say, what did you just say? How does that work exactly? Right. But then if you're non-educated, they say, wow, how can it be that we brought in the world's #1 terrorist with his weapon and army into Israel, and it actually increased violence? Why? How could that have happened? So that's the point. So totalitarian regimes don't want people to be educated. They want people to be uneducated so that they can manipulate them into believing the nonsense that the regime dishes out to the people.
Right. So I'm back in the main text. Just one moment.
Yes.
Okay. The comparison of knowledge to a tree of life underlies the organic connection and interdependence of all cognitive subjects. That's beautiful.
It really is. That's why it's an Etz Hayim, because the Etz has many different branches, and all knowledge is subsumed under the Etz. It's not contradictory. There is no contradiction between rhetoric and philosophy. There is no contradiction between context and content. There is no contradiction between inner and outer.
Right. As Maimonides puts it, everything which exists is as one single individual. Where does he say that?
In the Moneh Nebuchim, in Chelik Aleph, I think Perek Zay as Shiv'im or something like that, if I'm not mistaken, or close to Shiv'im. Check the footnote.
Okay, it's footnote 82, right? Yeah. Guide 172. Nice.
So Perek Shiv'im Mishtayim. Okay, I was off by 2 chapters. Nevertheless, the point of Maimonides is that there's an organic relationship between things, right? So there's an organic relationship between the flower that has this perfect things that grow, and the bee, which has, by coincidence, the ability or the design of its tool to pick up the pollen, right? it sucks the nectar and then it picks up the pollen from its body. So you have all these interconnected systems which are incredibly aligned and perfectly so. That's the true knowledge. How do things work together and the harmony that Hashem put in the world.
Right. That is, the whole universe is organically connected and interdependent. To the Hebrew mind, there are no autonomous, abstractly disconnected subjects or concepts that can only be examined in pristine intellectual isolation. By the way, sorry.
Part of the theory of evolution is exactly this. They have these things that kind of like exist, and then, you create 1,000 or 1,000,000 or 1,000,000,000 versions, and then you find the right thing, and somehow it continues to exist, but everything actually is competing, right? So in the original theory of evolution, as it was in the days of Darwin, now they changed it a little, survival of the fittest. So everything is against everything else. So I'm going to kill you, and because I kill you, I survive, and then something else will try to kill me, and that will survive, and the strongest will come out. So instead of a harmony in the universe, you have an atavism in the universe, where things are constantly in war and constantly opposed to each other. So you see the two views of the world.
Right. And by the way, the mere fact that in Am Yisrael, we see Maaseh Bereshit and Maaseh Merkavah as two interconnected disciplines of knowledge is very important, because no other, especially in today's world where there's a set polarization between the two. It's either you're religious and you don't believe in Maaseh Bereshit and in that whole world of things, or you're religiously scientific and you don't believe in religion in that whole world, right? Even in all other religions today in existence, it's like there's a polarization.
Yes. Okay, continue.
The philosophy-rhetoric split, already evident in the clash between Gorgias and Socrates, or Gorgias and Socrates, constitutes a pivotal moment in the intellectual history of the West. In mythological thinking, logos means both word and idea.
Yeah, right. So word represents rhetoric, idea represents philosophy.
Yes. We studied this together in the famous article. Right. Knowledge includes both meaning and the articulation of meaning. Meaning and literature were therefore inseparable and indistinguishable from one another. The division of knowledge, established by the philosophy-rhetoric opposition and the subsequent victory of the former over the latter, posited a new conception of meaning and language.
Okay, stop. I want to read those last 3 sentences again. I'm going to read it now. Okay. In mythological thinking, logos means both word and idea. So that means that in ancient mythology predates the split between rhetoric and knowledge. Knowledge includes both meaning and the articulation of meaning. And by the way, and to put it in our sense, if there is something that you cannot articulate linguistically, then there's something wrong with the knowledge, with that knowledge. And knowledge should be reducible to articulation. Meaning and literature were therefore inseparable and indistinguishable from one another. I think what's meant here is that you should be able to convey the story, as a literary work. So for example, you have the story of the Jewish people in the desert. So you convey that in the literature of the book of Bamidbar, right? So the story as conveyed in the book of Bamidrash, which is I'm trying to understand what he means, the story as conveyed in the book of Bamidbar of the Jewish people in the desert.
Where are you reading, Mehila?
A meaning and literature were therefore inseparable and indistinguishable from one another.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, the story of the Jewish people in the desert is not in opposition to what actually took place. What really took place, what really took place is this. So the story and the objective truth, to the extent that there is one, right? So the point is, in Western thinking, there is the objective, real truth, and then there is the way that truth is portrayed, and that the way the truth is portrayed is not the real objective truth. The point of this sentence is very amok and it's a little subtle, and that's why I'm having difficulty articulating it, but I think I will articulate it, hopefully. The point of this sentence is that the way we articulate the story is the story, right? There is nothing outside the articulation of the story. What we transmit to our children is the articulation, but that articulation is not a fabrication and it's not false. It represents how we experienced the event. So the experience that we had is fully reflected in our articulation of that experience. And then people say, oh no, but there was an objective reality that can never be, well, no, we're not interested in objective reality. We're interested in how we experience the reality of the Bamidbar, and that was conveyed in the book of Bamidbar. That was a point here that he was making, and it's a very subtle point. Hopefully he'll write more about it.
Where should I continue? The division of.
Yes.
The division of. Yeah?
Yes.
The division of knowledge established by philosophy, rhetoric, opposition, and the subsequent victory of the former over the latter posited a new conception of meaning and language. Right.
Right. Right. Because now language.
Philosophy beat rhetoric.
Right. Because now language no longer represents some sort of truth, because it's everything is manipulation, and words are used to manipulate.
Right. Meaning is determined by universal categories of thought, independent of any particular language.
Right. So there is an objective truth out there, and everything is measured by that universal category, and anything that doesn't meet that universal category is therefore, by definition, inferior.
Language is merely the means by which meaning is conveyed. Ideally, language ought to be absolutely innocent and unobtrusive.
Right. So language is like a mathematical formula. 1 + 1 = 2. And that has a very precise and very specific meaning. Similarly, language should be reflecting those universal categories perfectly, like geometry. And if it doesn't, then there's something wrong with the language, as often there is.
Right. The exclusion of writing from philosophy by Plato and the supremacy of the spoken word over the written script is intimately connected with this conception of meaning and language.
Right, because again, for the Greek thinkers, writing was a cheap fabrication of the actual truth, right? And therefore, at least if you're gonna use language, we need to use language because that's why we communicate. Let's go away from writing. Let's have a dialogue. Let's use speech, because at least in a speech, if you say something, I can ask you to clarify what you just said, and then I can ask you for another clarification. So while it's imperfect, but at least I can get to the truth. Whereas if you write something, the text can't speak back to you. Therefore, writing is terrible.
Mm-hmm.
That's literature. That's what Jeda meant before with literature, because literature is a written text as opposed to a dialogue. Continue.
Mm-hmm. Because the Greeks confused the categories of a particular language with the categories of universal thought, oral this is part of monolingualism, by the way, right?
Yes.
Oral communication gave the illusion of conveying pure meaning.
Right. So, in oral communication as opposed to written communication, right, oral can give the illusion of conveying pure meaning.
That is why they always needed a poet. They were very much against writing, and they always needed a poet or a muse to convey certain things and to say certain things. No?
Mm-hmm. Interesting.
He brings that in the horizontal.
Yes.
Thus, the presence-absence opposition.
That's another opposition. Another one of the rhetoric, philosophy rhetoric, there's also presence-absence.
Right. Presence is only possible in oral communication, whereas writing is the effect of absence or the disappearance of the real presence.
Right. So
writing is. Yeah.
Go ahead.
Writing is inferior, b'kitzur.
Yes. Yeah, because there is no presence. And when there is no presence, there is no dialogue. And if there is no dialogue, then your words can deceive me. But if I can have a dialogue with you, I can ask you to explain and to re-explain and to further explain. And then I can get to the real truth. Just 1 second, please. Continue, please.
The preeminence of speech over writing also posits the impossibility of reading. Right. Since speech is over writing, and writing is, in a sense, something very, very low class and low level and worthless, then, why read?
Because when I talk to you, I I can get into your mind by asking you more and more questions, and I can reveal your mind. When I read a written text, I can never reveal your mind because there's always going to be doubts as to what you meant by that word or this sentence.
Right. Ideally, the reader ought to be able to incorporate the mind of the author and fully understand the text.
That's the ideal.
Right. Since this is hardly possible, every reading may be in fact constructed as misreading.
Right. Every reading must be in fact construed as a misreading. So instead of having a reading, when you have a written text, you actually have a misreading. Let's see. Is there anything in the footnote here?
Daddy, when I went with my buff, I used to be at school.
Okay. So let's continue. Let's do another paragraph, and I have to go.
Okay. From this point of view, writing could only be conceived as supplement to speech, or as the outer expression of meaning in opposition to the inner natural sense. Right.
So you notice all these, so it's really fascinating because here he's showing how from that initial split, philosophy, rhetoric, you got the split presence, absence, outer, inner, content, context, right? You see everything is just from that one initial split.
Second, yes. Therefore, philosophy could not be read. Conversely, literature involves deviation from the original sense of the text from the truth.
Because the minute you transform the philosophy into words, you're corrupting the original thought. So not only does language not help, ultimately language corrupts, and therefore you have to have the actual truth. You should think and meditate upon the absolute truth, and that should be independent of the language you speak.
Yes.
Continue. Yeah.
For the Hebrews, meaning, signification, etc., are inseparable from text. Judaism does not recognize an atextual problem.
I love
meaning
that.
Yes.
That is so amazing. Every single kushya has to do with text. What did the Beraita say? What did the Mishnah say? What does the Pasuk say? How do you interpret the Pasuk? What derasha are you making the Pasuk? There is never, ever just an abstract discussion in the Gemara. What do you think about knowledge? No, everything is a Pasuk. It's really incredible how people from the yeshiva world, universally almost, but not exclusively, they all view the Gemara as if although it's a bunch of Greek logicians, Greek philosophers discussing logic, when philosophers are anti-text. And the Gemara, the very essence of the Gemara is predicated upon textual analysis. Amazing how they can make that intellectual jump. Look at the writings of Rav Kook. Everything are these abstract ideas that have no source in any text, whether rabbinic, whether Bible, no, but they're ideas. And then these ideas somehow are injected into the text, which in no way supports them, but you can inject any idea into any text, right? That's the nature of the game. So rabbinic thinking, textual, Greek thinking, not just atextual, anti-text.
Right. Meaning is a function of text, right? The ultimate object of reading is not to discover the mind of the author, but to generate meaning. Referring to Sefer Yetzirah, the Book of Creation, a work whose core dates from the 2nd century, Jorge Luis Borges remarked, I know that these books were not written for the purpose of being understood. They were made to be interpreted. They are goads so that the reader would follow the thought.
Amazing. That's an amazing sentence by Borges. Not everything can be understood. Do you really understand perfectly what Hashem meant with every single word? What was in Hashem's mind when he said that? Well, obviously no. But we can interpret the text and we can generate meaning from the text. So will we ever get to Hashem's mind? Well, we'll get meaning. We'll get wisdom. But no, we won't get Hashem's mind. You never get the author's mind. You don't get to do that.
Yes. I think we should
That's it. Okay.
wait. Yeah,
Actually, let's do one more paragraph because that completes the thought, and then we'll go to the next, and then the next one.
I wasn't sure if it does or not.
Yeah.
As will be seen, this applies to all texts read at the semantic level, where words are treated as signifiers in contradistinction to the semiotic level, words are treated as signified. Accordingly, meaning is not a given. It is not present. Rather, it is the product of reading.
Okay, let's actually do that paragraph tomorrow because it does go into a new
So that's what I thought.
Okay. Okay.